coronavirus crisis. More U.S. states are set to reverse their mask mandates. We have a report and analysis. Government funding. The federal budget stalemate may keep pro-life measures in effect. We're on Capitol Hill. Menacing missile. Iran touts its newest threat in an already weaponized Middle East. And message of hope. Pope Francis speaks out against the dangers of assisted suicide. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, February 9th, 2022. Thank you so much for being with us tonight on this Feast of St. Maron. I'm Tracy Sable. President Joe Biden's COVID-19 response team tells Americans to keep wearing masks in areas of high and substantial COVID-19 transmission, and that includes schools. But the governors of Connecticut, Delaware, New Jersey, and Oregon announced plans this week to lift school mask mandates by the end of February or March. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, if anyone was looking for President Biden's COVID-19 response team to say enough of the masks, well, they're going to have to keep on waiting. That's because today the team essentially said despite cases and hospitalizations falling, the nation is still not there. But others are not waiting any longer.
Pushing his stalled Build Back Better agenda, President Joe Biden met today with CEOs of electric utilities.
It's about reducing family energy bills while protecting the grid from extreme weather and making power more reliable.
But earlier, as his COVID-19 response team updated reporters on the pandemic, many of the questions were about masks and when they can come off.
But at this time, we continue to recommend masking in areas of high and substantial transmission. That's much of the country right now in public indoor settings.
The COVID-19 team also emphasizing decisions will have to be made community by community.
Policies at the local level will look at local cases. They'll look at how local hospitals are doing. They'll look at local vaccination rates.
At the same time, don't expect the mask mandate on planes, trains, and buses to just disappear. In fact, the transportation secretary, he says he's sick of masks too, but adds not every situation is the same.
A hospital is not the same as a school. A school is not the same as a bar, and a bar is not the same thing as a plane.
Meanwhile, as students sit for hours masked,
I don't think we've even really fully realized the damage that we have done to our children with masking these past 2 years. I think we're probably just beginning to see the beginning of it.
And in an interview with the Heritage Foundation.
So I think things are moving in a very positive direction. There was only weak evidence for the effectiveness of masks anyway.
Whether more masks are ditched, caught in between, are parents and students either in favor or against wearing them.
It's time for us to begin to understand that COVID is probably going to be here for a while, and we need to learn to live with it and leave the kids alone.
Also tonight, the governors of New York and Illinois have said masks can come off in indoor spaces. However, that does not include schools just yet. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
While the U.S. House of Representatives passes another continuing resolution to fund the government through March 11th, this will avoid a possible shutdown if the Senate follows suit. However, some Republicans have concerns about the long-term effects temporary funding has on critical programs. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us now. So, Eric, what are members most worried about?
Well, Tracy, Republicans tell me what they're most concerned about are national security issues, in particular funding for our military, especially what's taking place along the Ukraine border right now. But we have learned within the past hour that lawmakers in both the House and the Senate, they come to an agreement on the framework of the 2022 government funding bill. However, when I asked how much it's going to cost, they wouldn't elaborate on that number just yet. Bottom line, Republicans say that a permanent 2022 government funding bill needs to take place quickly.
If we do, let's say, another continuing resolution, all that does is we're continuing spending from where it was before forward. And it could be that you don't want to have certain things in there to begin with. You have changes out there ought to be made. But in this case, again, we're not doing our job.
Kicking the can down the road, and that means military funding is currently frozen at 2021 levels. Catholic Congressman Rodney Davis tells me the Defense Department needs more money to meet growing threats from Russia, China, and cyber attacks, among others.
These short-term continuing resolutions, they put many critical military projects in jeopardy because they're not going to be funded long-term. They won't be started, they won't be completed, and in the end, this is not the way to govern.
And there's another concern. Policy riders like pro-life protections have been added annually to federal budgets. The current extension includes those protections left over from the Trump administration. But Democrats like Catholic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have publicly said she doesn't want Hyde Amendment protections put into these bills. She also wants to codify Roe v. Wade. West Virginia Congressman Alex Mooney, also a Catholic, says pro-lifers on the Hill will stand strong.
It's wrong to spend taxpayer dollars on killing unborn children, but that's what's happening in the House of Representatives today. We need to change that. We need to limit spending the things that are morally right and also necessary.
We're going to continue to fight for the Hyde protections, not just in short-term bills, but in long-term funding bills too. It's the right thing to do because it saves lives.
It's important to note, as I reported earlier this week, Senator James Langford has assured me that pro-life protections, all pro-life protections, such as the Hyde Amendment, the Helms Amendment, and others, will be in the 2022 government funding spending bill. However, he wants to see it in writing first. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And also on Capitol Hill, lawmakers will soon recognize Catholic schools with a bipartisan bill. Republican Congressman Darren LaHood is co-sponsoring a resolution highlighting the importance of Catholic schools across the country.
How impactful Catholic schools are to our youth today, from a spiritual standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. And so this was a way to honor our Catholic schools across the country.
According to the National Catholic Education Association, more than 1.6 million students were enrolled in about 6,000 Catholic schools last year, and more than 20% of the students are non-Catholic. Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania is co-sponsoring the Senate version of the resolution. A Catholic group has asked the Justice Department to vigilantly address vandalism against churches nationwide. A response from the Assistant Attorney General to Catholic Vote says resources are under review to ensure protection for houses of worship. Lawmakers in Vermont have approved a bill that would place the right to an abortion into the state constitution. Vermont's governor, a Republican, is expected to sign the plan. That said, it will still need to be approved by voters in the November midterm elections. Well, for the first time, the head of Egypt's highest court will be a Coptic Christian. Judge Boulos Fahmy was chosen by President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who has previously taken other steps to empower Christians in the Muslim-majority nation. Taiwan's president has welcomed the foreign minister of Somaliland to highlight mutual political and economic ties, a move that has angered officials in China. Taiwan's president says the countries have shared coronavirus resources. In reaction, China's foreign minister accused Taiwan of fanning flames, adding the meeting ultimately will hurt Taipei. Well, Iran has unveiled a new ballistic missile to threaten the U.S. and Israel. Latest weapon can accurately penetrate regional U.S. bases and targets in Israel with a 900-mile range combined with improved shielding systems. The missile's unverified claims come as Iran continues international talks over its nuclear program. And joining me now to discuss this is Lester Munson, Senior Fellow at the National Security Institute and Principal International at BGR Group. Lester, great to see you again. Thanks so much for taking the time. Certainly a lot to talk to today, but I do want to start with Iran. What more do you know about this new weapon, and should we be concerned?
Well, it's important to remember that Iran has a robust weapons program. They are pursuing nuclear weapons. They've been pursuing missile technology for many years. When President Obama did his famous Iran nuclear deal, missiles were intentionally left out of that deal. So since 2015, when the Iran nuclear deal was first brought forward 7 years ago, Iran has still been able to pursue this missile technology. So what we're seeing here is really a failure of international diplomacy over the past few years in dealing smartly with Iran. We should have addressed this issue back in 2015 when we had the chance to get them to enact curbs on programs like these. There's no question Iran is the biggest threat to our interests in the Middle East. These missile tests demonstrate that rather effectively.
Yeah, I want to turn now to the situation unfolding between Russia and Ukraine. The Pentagon is now saying a plan's in place to put U.S. troops in Poland to help Americans evacuate Ukraine if Russia invades. That said, there seems to be a lot of mixed messages when it comes to this situation. How likely do you think a Russian invasion really is?
Well, we don't really know. I'm not sure Vladimir Putin even knows, but it is certainly a possibility. Vladimir Putin has amassed over 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. If he wants to, he can go in. He can send those forces into Ukraine, and they would very, very likely take over the country rather quickly. I don't believe anyone knows if he's made up his mind yet. I suspect at the end of the day, my guess would be he's not going to have a full-fledged invasion. It will be something much more modest, such as a land bridge from Russia towards Crimea, the part of Ukraine they took back in 2014. But really, no one knows at the end of the day. And I do want to say there's been some mixed messages from the Biden administration on this, but in the last day or two, that's gotten better. President Biden has shown unity with European allies in this regard. So there is some good news here.
Well, speaking of President Putin, on Friday, he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. The two leaders agreed that there is, quote, no limit to their strategic partnership. Lester, what do you think that signals, and how concerned should the U.S. and our allies be about this?
Well, it's a serious thing, and there's no doubt that Russia and China have recognized the fact that they're both opposed to the West, to the United States, to individual rights and freedom and democracy, and that they have a mutual interest in collaborating against us and the expansion of NATO and things like that. However, there are no real shared interests between Russia and China at the end of the day. And a lot of that rhetoric, and they attach that to about a 5,000-word long document that kind of overstates the case for their cooperation. There are real issues between those two countries. They are not natural allies. They never have been. And at some point, China's going to figure out that Russia is a very small country with not many people in it and a lot of natural resources that China needs. And then we're going to see some real issues on the Eurasian continent.
Lester, not a whole lot of time left, but wondering, what are you keeping your eye on when it comes to threats?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's all of these things in concert. What we're really seeing is Iran, Russia, and China collaborating together. The fact that the Iran nuclear deal talks are again on in Europe right now at the same time that Russia is massing troops on the border with Ukraine, and that President Xi Jinping is trying to lock down an unprecedented third term in power in Beijing this year. Those things are all of a piece. They are working in concert against us, and it is very important for the United States and its allies to recognize that. These are not three separate crises. This is one big crisis that we need to deal with.
Yeah, and all very, very concerning. Lester, thank you so much for your time. We always appreciate your analysis.
Thank you.
Coming up, a conference focuses on protecting the media and freedom of speech around the world. Pope Francis speaks out against assisted suicide. He says the sick need care, not a quicker death.
Questo è spingerli più presto verso la morte.
At his weekly talk to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father encouraged the faithful to have hope as they approach death, saying the resurrection of our Lord helps us overcome all of our worries and anxiety. Pope Francis also says that he is praying for a peaceful solution to the tensions in Ukraine. A meeting to discuss ways to defend freedom of the press around the world begins today in Eastern Europe. The third global conference for media freedom is beginning and being held in Estonia. It seeks to strengthen freedom of speech and safety for journalists around the world. The gathering features representatives around 46 countries. Our next guest is among those seeking to defend these important freedoms. Joining us now from Rome is Christopher Trott, Great Britain's ambassador to the Holy See. Mr. Ambassador, great to see you. Thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell us more about the conference and how your embassy is involved?
Well, it's a sort of global conference, so it's not just my embassy, it's actually the British government and all British embassies across the world. We've been running or co-chairing a thing called a Global Coalition that's seeking to promote media freedom and protect those journalists, particularly those working in less tolerant places around the world, to enable them to do their jobs. And so today in Estonia, for 2 days, there's a sort of meeting of all the countries that are part of this effort. To date, there are 50 different countries that are involved. But actually, the number of journalists who are supportive of this campaign is far, far greater. And I personally was very involved in supporting this campaign when I was British ambassador to South Sudan in my last job, where journalists are doing a really critical role trying to hold the leaders of South Sudan to account for the commitments they made to the people of South Sudan in a peace agreement 4 years ago. And they come under regular attack and frequent arrest and put their lives at risk in order to be able to try and do their jobs and be able to try and support democracy in that country. So you go from everything from a sort of very safe, comfortable environment like this one all the way through to supporting journalists and in an environment like that one.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for us being here in the United States to understand that, what some other journalists go through on a daily basis just to tell the stories. Thank you for bringing that up. I want to switch gears slightly. I know the last time that you were here and on the show, you had just arrived in Rome several months later. How is your job going? What are some of the challenges and what are some of the highlights for you?
Well, the highlight was actually the meeting that we spoke about when we were last online. But over the last couple of months, obviously, I've got to try and I've been able to work my way around the Vatican a bit more. So being able to understand how the different bits of the Vatican operate, how the Vatican engages not just with the Catholic Church worldwide, but also then how it engages as a state with other states worldwide is something that isn't evident, even for me as an experienced ambassador. It's a learning process, and I've been learning a lot over the last couple of months. I have to say, though, my highlight, I guess, for the last month or so was a very personal one, and that was being able to participate in some extraordinarily beautiful services over Christmas and New Year, being able to listen to Pope Francis addressing the crowds, a diminished crowd, both because of COVID, but also the weather was terrible on the 25th of December. And then being able to listen to Pope Francis as he addressed the diplomatic corps on the 10th of January, which was a very powerful occasion where Pope Francis was talking directly to us as ambassadors, but not because of us as ambassadors, but directly, therefore, through us to our governments.
Ambassador, I also want to ask you, before we let you go, are there any other projects that you're working on right now or currently in the works?
So, I mean, there are a couple of things that we're looking to partnership with the Holy See on. We're continuing to think about how we can engage on climate, because obviously that's something through Laudato Si and the Pope's own personal commitment. It's something that is very important to the Vatican. We're also looking at modern slavery. And yesterday, or the day before yesterday, was a day for prayer for modern slavery and human trafficking. And we've been supporting some of the organizations that are seeking to address that as a global issue. And then we're following up also on some activity we've done with religious sisters, with some religious organizations, particularly in supporting girls' education. We have a partnership that's looking at trying to promote girls' education worldwide, again, particularly in places like South Sudan.
Yeah, big projects, very important projects as well. I know that you're a very, very busy man, so we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Christopher Trott, Great Britain Ambassador to the Holy See. Hope to see you again.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you.
Up next, hear more about the founder of the Maronite Church on his feast day. Today is a public holiday in Lebanon for the Feast of St. Maron, a 4th century Syriac hermit monk who founded the spiritual movement that grew into the Maronite Church, which is in full communion with the Holy See. Father Mitch Pacwa dedicated today's EWTN Mass to St. Maron, who was known as a great mystic, miracle worker, and missionary. His holiness attracted many followers, especially in Lebanon, which to this day has the largest percentage of Christians in the Middle East. And join me now to discuss the life and legacy of this great saint is Bishop Gregory John Mansour of the Maronite Eparchy of St. Maron of Brooklyn. Your Excellency, wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Tracy.
What can you tell us about the life of St. Maron, what he means to the people of Lebanon, and also why he's usually depicted wearing a black hood?
Yes, the black hood I also wear, all of the bishops wear, because we come from the monks. And the Maronite Church was a monastic movement that became a church. It had no desire, perhaps at the beginning, to become a church, but it was these evangelical monks following St. Maron, who was a priest and a hermit, who desired to be close to God and close to people.
And he had such a fascinating, such a simple life, completely devoted to God, as we know. As we get closer to Lent, what do you think he can teach us about centering our spiritual life?
Well, his whole life was, he was what's called an open air hermit. So, number one, he was open to God in the nature, and number two, he's open to people. And that openness to God and openness to people without any barriers was his asceticism. And that can really teach us something in Lent, that the more we are open to God and open to people, the more we can spread God's good news and God's love for us.
Yeah, that's a wonderful message. I know that you've described him as a great unifier. What can we learn from his spiritual example, especially, during this tumultuous time that we're seeing in Lebanon?
Yeah, Tracy, because he was such an open person, open to God and open to others, he helped his heritage, the Maronite people of Lebanon and Syria, helped to form modern-day Lebanon, which was not a Christian enclave, but a Christian-Muslim conviviality. So 100 years ago, our patriarch and the Sunni Mufti and different Shiite and Druze representatives of their people wanted something called Lebanon to be an inclusive haven for the different religious communities. And that's really to the spirit of St. Maron.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because that's something I think a lot of people probably don't know. I'm wondering how St. Maron, if you could talk about this, how he inspires you and also your leadership at the eparchy that bears his name.
Well, I try to be a little bit more like a hermit, that is, think and go deep within myself before making a lot of decisions. And I try to really be open to God and open to other people. In that sense, it helps me to realize that my forebearer, the father of the Maronite Church, had the same spirituality.
That is so wonderful. And is there anything about St. Maron that you think is really important for people to know?
Yes, I think he was a priest, and a priest is not ordained to be by himself, but he must have felt priests and people were taking things for granted. So that's why he moved out into the highlands of Syria and began as a hermit with a ministry to people, and so that we don't take our Christian faith for granted.
That is so wonderful. And thank you so much, Bishop Gregory, for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it. God bless you.
Thank you, Tracy.
And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.